gives me great pleasure to introduce Emma McGibbon, who and Gabby as well, who have been instrumental in understanding more about the neurodevelopmental problems that a lot of you face, particularly in children. And so I think you're going to give us some updates on how the study's been going so far and some of the insights from that. And also you'll be able to talk a little bit more later on in the workshops as well. So a little introduction. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name's Emma McGibbon. I have been part of the BBS service for a number of years now at Great Ormond Street and also at St Thomas's, so I may be familiar to some of you.
And hi everyone, my name's Gabby. I'm a trainee clinical psychologist at the University of Surrey, but previously I also worked at Great Ormond Street alongside Emma in the BBS clinic, and have continued my work with BBS through research, but it's our first time at conference face-to-face, so we're very pleased to be here.
So as Phil said, we're going to talk about some research that we are looking to do into neurodevelopmental profiles of children and young people with BBS. So to start with, I'm going to explain what we mean by neurodevelopmental profiles. So a long term, and it refers really to the brain's formation of pathways that affect development. So the brain development is responsible for how we develop our thinking skills, how we develop our sensory skills, social abilities, our attention, all sorts of aspects of our development. And so neurodevelopment is this kind of overall term that refers to how people are developing. And so neurodevelopmental differences are where there are differences in how people develop these abilities due to different patterns in people's brains. So neurodevelopmental differences begin early in children's development, and we see, or we can kind of have a look at different types of skills at different points of a child's development. But these abilities continue to develop into adulthood. So we are talking about identifying different neurodevelopmental differences that you might be familiar with. So there's various different terms, such as autism spectrum condition, which is thinking about how people's social development is carrying on throughout their childhood and into adolescence and adulthood. Thinking about how people's attention is developing. Some people might have some difficulties with attention. Some people might find it difficult with their activity levels being a bit increased. So that's when people might get a diagnosis of something like ADHD or attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And another area of development that we're thinking of is intellectual or learning disability, which we'll explain. Will I explain it now?
Yeah.
A little bit later. So when we're thinking about BBS and neurodevelopmental differences, we know that BBS has a huge range of people's abilities. So some people are more likely to experience what we call intellectual disability, which is known as a learning disability. And this is talking about how people are able to learn at school and continue to function in their daily lives when they're at school and when they're adults. So when we're thinking about an intellectual disability, we are talking about people whose thinking skills are at an earlier stage than other people of their age or their stage of development. And this can affect how you can learn at school. It can affect how you learn self-care skills, so things like dressing yourself or finding your way around a school building to your next lesson, or how you might access the community, go to a library or go to a shop and work out your money. So all of these things are thought about together, and some people, when they're adults, who have an intellectual disability might live on their own. They might need a bit of extra help with things like managing their finances or important decisions in their lives. Other people who have an intellectual disability might need help with multiple aspects of their day-to-day living. So they might need help with washing, with dressing, with making their own meals and looking after themselves. So we know that people with BBS are more likely to have an intellectual disability, although, as I said before, there's a huge range of abilities, and this isn't the case for everybody. Another aspect of neurodevelopment that we know can be different for people with BBS is in what we call social communication. So that's how people are understanding the social world. So the fact that often when we meet somebody, we say hello to them, we might make some small talk, we might be polite. There's these unwritten social rules that we have in society, and this affects how we interact with people. Social communication is also talking about how we develop friendships, how we maintain our friendships and relationships with other people, and also it refers to how our kind of range of interests. So some people with social communication differences might have a narrower range of interests that they really like to focus on, compared to other people who might have more of a range of interests that they might dip in and out of. So people with autism, a diagnosis of autism, have difficulties with their social communication, as well as maybe having a narrower range of interests that they like to spend their time doing. So some people with BBS might have differences in how they communicate with people, how they interact with people, and some people might have a diagnosis of autism, which is where these experiences have been identified as maybe causing some difficulties in school or with their social situation. Okay, so what we are hoping to do is explore a little bit more detail about BBS and neurodevelopment. So we know that there has been research that's happened before, so going back to 2002. This was the first study to look at this, and this was carried out by clinicians at Great Ormond Street, including Professor Biedl. And for this study, back then, they asked parents to complete questionnaires. There were 21 parents that participated in this study. And they also asked children to do some assessments of their thinking skills, so what we call cognitive skills. And what they found when they looked at the thinking skills of this group of children was that there was a big range of ability. So some children were able to show that their thinking skills were in what we call the average range, so similar to their same age peers. And there were a large number whose thinking skills were lower than that. And so overall, the group were showing weaker cognitive skills than other people of their age. So this was identified as something that was more common in children with BBS. When they looked at the questionnaires that were filled out by parents, they were showing that children with BBS were showing higher levels of difficulties with anxiety and their mood. And also some difficulties with focusing their attention, probably at school or at home. And also some differences in how they were communicating and interacting, this social communication that I was talking about before. So they found that there are unmet needs or unidentified needs for children with BBS. And then coming forwards a little bit, this research has been carried out in 2016 in Finland, and they looked at the effects of BBS in a wider age range. So they looked at, they had participants from the age of 6 to 38 years old, so it covered childhood to adulthood. And again, they did some of these testing of these thinking skills and asked people to fill out questionnaire findings. And the results were consistent with the previous study, that there was a big range of ability from the average range, and a large proportion of people had skills that were lower than average who had BBS. And again, they're kind of adaptive functioning or day-to-day functioning that I was speaking about, looking after yourself, accessing the community, being able to be independent. Those abilities were actually lower than we might expect given their thinking skills, given their cognitive functioning. So there was something that was causing difficulties in addition to the cognitive skills, it seemed. Again, they showed that mood was an issue for a number of people with BBS, and those differences in how they're communicating and with the social communication. So again, the research is pointing us in a direction that there is this large variability, but there are a number of people who are showing these neurodevelopmental profiles with areas of difference. Okay. So I'm going to hand over to Gabby.
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, so as Emma's kind of already outlined some of the research, we know that there is a little bit of research already looking into this area, but it is quite limited. So there's not been very many studies so far, and not very many people have had the opportunity to take part in these studies so far. And we know that this is an area of difficulty that is described by families. So we've been told that most support available for people with BBS, including things like education, health and care plans, or EHCPs, often tends to focus on people's medical needs, and neurodevelopmental differences or behavioural needs and things like that tend not to be covered so much, so there seems to be less support. We're hoping to provide a bit more evidence about why this is important for people with BBS. And the hope would be that we can get a better understanding of people's strengths and any areas of difficulty as well, which would be helpful for both families and professionals. And we might be able to make some suggestions about resource development and how we can best support people with BBS. So the current study, as we mentioned, is looking into neurodevelopmental profiles of children and young people with BBS. And again, this is because these differences usually present quite early on during childhood, but we do know that they continue into adulthood and across the lifespan. So the hope is that we'll be able to identify some areas of support for people with BBS across the lifespan. And the project will be made up of two separate but overlapping studies. The first one looking at data from questionnaires completed by parents and carers, and the second one looking at information gathered from direct assessments. So study one, the questionnaire data. Questionnaires have been completed by parents or carers of children and young people with BBS in the Gosh BBS clinic. And so far we've had about 43 parents and carers complete responses back in 2021, and we're still hoping for a few more. And we'll go through some initial findings from this today, but these are going to be analysed in a lot more detail later on. For study two, this is still in the early stages, and we're currently waiting for the administrative ethical approval to go through. But once this has been finalised, children and young people will be invited to come to Gosh for a direct assessment, which will be with myself and Emma. And that will include a cognitive assessment like Emma was talking about before, so the thinking skills, as well as getting some more information from parents and carers too. And then once we've kind of collected all of that information together, it will be added to an anonymised database. So what that means is that any kind of information that connects the person who provided it to the data will be removed. So nobody outside of that clinic will be able to tell where that data's come from when we're sharing it outside of that. We'll also be contacting families who've recently had an assessment already at Great Ormond Street with Emma to ask if they'd be happy for us to add their anonymised data to the project. So some preliminary findings from the questionnaires already. There's two pie charts up on the screen, and they're looking at the social communication difficulties. So the pie chart on the left is looking at one threshold, so whether social communication difficulties were identified by the parent or carer rating on the questionnaire or whether they weren't. And these were the 43 responses we've had so far. And the green area is a large majority of the circle, and that shows that 80% of children were rated as experiencing difficulties with their social communication by a parent or carer. And then the graph on the right goes into a little bit more detail and breaks that down to see kind of what these differences were identified. So the light green is in the mild range, the blue is in the moderate range, and then the largest chunk of the pie, which is over half of the responses, was in the severe range. So some quite significant social communication differences were identified by most of the parents and carers that have taken part. So there were quite a few questionnaires, if anyone's completed them, that we've asked people to do, and we'll also be looking at things like behaviour, mood, as well as health-related quality of life, and looking at a few more things, as well as looking again at this social communication differences and trying to understand a little bit more about that in more detail. In terms of the direct assessment, there's been a pilot neurodevelopmental assessment clinic run at Great Ormond Street for children with BBS, which has been run for 1 year. But as I mentioned, Emma and I will be continuing to see some children and young people for assessments. And a number of children who have been assessed in the clinic so far, they have identified learning needs that do meet the criteria for an intellectual disability, which is in line with some of that previous research that we've seen. And families have kind of often come aware if there's been any difficulties in certain areas at school or anything like that, but formal identification hadn't really been done up until that point. So hopefully this can open up access for lots of people to get some additional support. Another finding, or something else from the clinic that we've noticed, is that regardless of whether children and young people did meet the criteria for an intellectual disability, motor skills were identified as an area of need for all children that have been assessed so far in that pilot clinic. And that includes both fine motor, which is your smaller motor skills, so things like holding a pen, as well as gross motor, which is larger, so that would be things like jumping or hopping, for example. In terms of study number 2 that I was talking about before with the assessments, once the administrative approval has come through, we will be conducting further assessments at GOSH, and we are hosting a workshop later if anyone has any more questions about that or is interested in kind of registering your interest to take part. And thank you everybody for listening. Does anybody have any questions for me and Emma?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Who wants to go first? There's a microphone going around.
Can I ask about with the kids and young adults? With all this, did you test anything like with speech and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So,
because when I was a kid, I had to go to speech therapist. I'm just wondering, I struggle pronouncing some words as well, so just wondering if that's a factor as well.
Yeah. So when we do the cognitive assessments, that looks at a range of different skills. So it looks at your verbal reasoning, which is answering questions. So we're thinking about the language that people are using, and also non-verbal skills. So, when children have the vision to be able to look at pictures and make sense of visual patterns, for instance, then we're looking at those skills as well. We didn't do language assessments that a speech and language therapist would do. Language and communication is very much interlinked, of course, and so we're thinking about communication styles more than the specifics of language that a speech and language therapist would do. But these neurodevelopments, we kind of try and think about it by thinking in different strands, like language and speech and non-verbal thinking skills, but in reality, we use a lot of these skills all together. So it's a bit of a false distinction. So so we're thinking about some aspects of language, but not about the mechanics of language.
Just a quick one. So you, on one of the slides, you said that the research showed FS/Q 1.5 lower. What does that actually mean in real terms?
Yeah, so, thank you. That was a technical bit of jargon on there. So when we're doing cognitive assessments, we are looking at where children's scores lie on a normal distribution curve. So it's like a bell-shaped curve. So most people are in the big chunk in the middle, and then there's the extremes where there are fewer people. And the middle is where we would expect, the middle kind of chunk is where we would expect most of the children to be. And if you are 1.5 standard deviations below, that means that you are outside of the average range within the kind of tail end. So it means that if you imagine the kind of normal distribution for the typical population who don't have any conditions like BBS, you would shift it along, and that's where you would expect people's abilities to be. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'll show you with a diagram later if that would help.
Hello, I've just got a question. When we're looking at the children and young people with social, emotional and additional learning needs, are you able to break down at all, with especially the anxiety and emotional feelings and that, if they've had access and continue to have access to really good early intervention support services and that, are the young people and children and parents reporting that maybe there is less social problems and anxiety, or is that not something that you can sort of pick out of the reports yet?
For BBS, we haven't specifically looked at that, but what we do know is that for people who are on the autism spectrum, early intervention, early support is really very important for children's emotional development, how they are managing and how their families are managing. One of the sets of questions that we did, that we have gathered but we haven't examined yet, is about the quality of life of the family member who filled out the questionnaire, and also the quality of life of the child and young person. So we are wondering whether these are linked to things like the emotional state of the child. If they are experiencing high levels of anxiety, does that mean therefore that the family's mood and quality of life has been affected? So we're trying to we've taken a snapshot where we're trying to have a look at and see what are the important influences for parents and family members.
Right, we will have to move on, so thank you so much, Emma and Gabby.